Hello, welcome to this lesson, looking at the second part of the challenge to Elizabeth's religious settlement, this time from the Catholics, mainly focusing on the Catholics at home initially, but there's some links to Europe as well throughout this. So I suppose I'm telling you that to consider how a Catholic threat abroad could be a separate paragraph to a Catholic threat at home. So let's get started into this. Wondering as well, before we even start, whether or not we think just naturally, based on the scale and size of the Catholics around Europe, not just in England, is this automatically going to be more dangerous to Elizabeth than those Puritans? But as always, this is your decision to make, up to you. So let's see. Is the Catholic threat more dangerous to Elizabeth, or was it rather, than the Puritans? So let's have a little think about each of these as we go. You can pop them in your book or your notes if you wish, or just think about them as we talk through them. Which of these are generally threatening to Elizabeth, directly to her or the settlement? The Pope. Do we think the Pope is more of a threat to Elizabeth or to the settlement? I think possibly both. Remember, we've talked already, haven't we, in the last lesson, that the Pope has told his Catholics in England not to go to her church. So you can see how the influence there is a bit of both. The power of the bishops from Mary's reign. I feel like they could try and stop the settlement. They have some influence in Parliament, and of course they may have some influence in the churches around the country, although she has got rid of most of them by making them take the oath and get their license. So I don't know. I can see the potential of a threat there. The fear of the Catholic nobles, is that more of a threat to Elizabeth? I think that definitely should be a threat to her directly, because they have soldiers essentially at their command. Also, they could undermine the settlement if they stop going to church and become recusants. Then why would the people keep going? Because they're going to look at their superiors and think, well, if it's good enough for them, it's good enough for us, I guess. English people not attending church, I think that's definitely more of a threat to the settlement, because they're not seeing it, they're not doing it, they're not following it. But ultimately, that is undermining the Queen as well. So a little bit of both potentially there. Mary, Queen of Scots, definitely more of a threat to Elizabeth herself than the settlement, because Mary was there before the settlement and she's going to be there regardless of the settlement. So I would say Mary, Queen of Scots is definitely a more direct threat to Elizabeth based on her claim to the throne. The fact that England is 90% Catholic, I want to say that this is a bigger threat to Elizabeth and the settlement, because they could just decide not to do it. But as we know, in general, they just plodded along with it. They got on with it, didn't they? Partly because they could do their own service at home. So it didn't prove really, or certainly initially didn't prove to be that big a deal or a challenge. But there's potential there again, isn't there? Elizabeth not being strict enough, I feel like that could become an issue again, potentially. People might think, oh, well, I just won't go because she's not enforcing it, she's not fining us. It might empower people perhaps to be a little bit more rebellious. And then lastly, the papal bull and the excommunication. We'll learn about that in this lesson. So for now, we can move on from that. Essentially what that is the Pope issues a papal bull. It's a letter where he threatens to excommunicate the Queen and anyone who doesn't really follow his orders. Excommunication is bad, very bad in religion. Essentially, it can stop you going to heaven. And of course, the Pope has got the power to do that because he is God's man on earth. I often think to myself, why would the Protestant care? Because they're obviously not Catholic, but this excommunication obviously carries some weight as well for every man in the street too. They're the ones who aren't sure about what to do or who to follow. It's quite scary. So that might make people do what the Pope wants because they're scared of going to hell, which again could undermine the Queen and the settlement. So a bit of a mixed bag in there. A lot of them, you could argue, is both really, aren't they? Okay, so how you should probably set this up. If you are doing this from Google Classroom, then you'll have this worksheet. Otherwise, just set your notes up like this with these little subtitles. As we go through this lesson, we'll answer each of these little questions. All right, so if you want to just pause the video to write this down or set it up on a Google Doc, wherever you're doing it, and then we'll come back to the lesson when you're ready and we can start filling these gaps in. Okay, so challenge 1 then from the Pope. You can fill in that sheet there. I want to fight back against Protestantism and strengthen the Catholic Church. I want Catholics to unite and take back power in a counter-reformation. So a counter-attack, if you know in football, is where you go from one end of the pitch to the other, hopefully scoring a goal. This is going to counter Henry VIII's English Reformation by turning England back to Catholic. That's his mission, that's his goal, and he is going to call on whoever he can to help him. And obviously Philip II of Spain is going to be up there as his sort of number one. Okay, so the Pope, or the papacy, you might see it written down as the papacy. It just means the Pope. Okay, although the Catholic Church was trying to stop the spread of Protestantism, oh, that sounds quite Cold War, isn't it? A bit of containment, a bit of Truman doctrine. It was also trying to restore the power of Catholicism by persecuting heretics. Now, a heretic is a name given to people who go against the religion of the country. All right, so in this case, when the Catholics were in power, they would have referred to the Protestants as heretics, and then vice versa. But it generally is a word used to describe someone going against the religion of the country. And he is encouraging these heretics to come out and have this counter-reformation. But remember that most of them are moderate, and most of them have chosen to get on with the settlement. This sort of a change, all of a sudden, there's a bit of a tone change, isn't there? All of a sudden as the years went on, and a lot of it I think is to do with Mary Queen of Scots, but we'll be doing that over the next few lessons. All right, so how is this going to affect England, this sort of decree from the Pope telling these Catholics to fight back? I feel like it's kind of obvious, isn't it, that it's going to maybe make some of these people become recusants. It's probably going to take their focus and attention away from the Queen, doing what the Queen wants. They're going to be in this sort of limbo of trying to please the Pope, and then of course please God, because they don't want to go to hell. So it's going to change the tone of the country. It's going to change the context. I suppose arguably we could say in a really informal way that this is now the end of the honeymoon period for the Queen. I feel like she's had quite a decent sort of first 6 to 10 years, not a lot going on. She's passed her settlement. The country's generally improving after the poor harvests. And she's quite fair and middle ground. So most of the people are just sort of getting on with it. Now this Pope is starting to get involved, opposing the settlement directly and indirectly. I feel like, yeah, Elizabeth should possibly be a little bit more worried. All right, so some terms to think about. Remember, we've said, haven't we, some definitions of this course are words we don't use a lot. So just to take a little step aside before we move on with the content, you may want to make a little note of what a papal bull is. It is a letter from the Pope with a message, sometimes encouraging war or to excommunicate a member of the church. Now remember, that's probably the worst thing that can happen, is that you can be excommunicated by the Pope. That means you're not going to heaven. You can't have the Mass at church, so basically you're going to hell. So if you remember in the Germany course, the Pope sent a papal bull, didn't he, encouraging again the Catholics to not go to his Reich Church. It's incredibly similar. That was in order to undermine Hitler, and this papal bull is exactly the same, to try and undermine Elizabeth by telling the Catholics not to go to Elizabeth's church. So that's quite a nice little link there across the two courses. And then excommunication, as we've said, is a punishment from the Pope banning you from taking communion, the Mass, and therefore if you can't take the Mass, you can't go to heaven. This is a serious threat in Tudor times. When everyone was Catholic, it absolutely was even more dangerous. Even King Henry VIII or any Catholic monarch, they thought twice about what they were doing, going way back to King John, the Archbishop of Canterbury. In fact, always, the Pope's ability to excommunicate essentially meant that most people backed down from going to war with the Pope, because ultimately eternity in hell wasn't quite worth that fight. So they're two terms that will play a massive part in this religious course. All right, so let's carry on then. So in 1566, so we are approaching quite a serious amount of time in power by now. So, you know, nearly 10 years. The Pope has issued this instruction to the Catholics that they should not attend Elizabeth's Church of England. We've talked a lot about why that might undermine Elizabeth, and they're not following through with her instructions, the royal injunctions. It's just about trying to break up the Protestant stronghold and this counter-reformation. I feel like we need to emphasise the fact that because it's the Pope saying it, it definitely carries a lot more weight than some random Catholic priest who's not happy with life in England. So although Elizabeth's punishments have not been so far that dramatic or enforced, if at all, the order from the Pope mean that these recusants are now going to start being fined. She's got to take it seriously, hasn't she? Because the Pope has said it. So if she is quite weak now, then of course all the Catholics in the end, they're just not going to go to church. So now in 1566, nearly 10 years in, she does start to fine these people a little bit more, or the local authorities do, the JPs, the magistrates, things like that. So repeat offenders, if they get told off and they continue to not go to church, then they're going to be fined, imprisoned, loss of property, they lose their job, or even worse, they would lose their life. So we don't want to start that, because that's pushing Elizabeth to be more like Mary, isn't it? Killing people for their religious beliefs. Although you could argue this is not quite killing them for their religious beliefs. This is killing them for failing to follow the law. But she's got to make it clear to the English. He might be saying this, the Pope, but I'm saying you better go to church. Make your choice. The vast majority of the country chose Elizabeth, surprisingly. Maybe that surprises you, considering their loyalty to the Pope. I just feel like most people just don't want chaos in their life. Having just spent the last 25 years of the religious roller coaster, they're probably quite enjoying this relatively calm country at the moment. So Elizabeth is cautious that she doesn't want to create martyrs, though. If she starts killing these Catholics, like her sister created martyrs killing Protestants, basically it's going to cause loads of problems. It's going to make Catholics turn against Elizabeth. It's going to really mess up this balance that she's got of trying to keep the country kind of plain. If she starts killing Catholics, she's going to start having Catholics, banging on the door, angry. Just like what Mary did. That's one of the things Mary got very wrong, was making martyrs out of the Protestants. So that's kind of where she is. The Pope has made Elizabeth think by sending this papal bull and the excommunication. So things are going to change. Now, just a little bit of a spoiler. In 2 years from now, in 1568, Mary Queen of Scots is going to come to England. She's going to escape from a bit of a story up there in Scotland, which we'll talk about in a few lessons' time. She's now in the country, in England, with the Pope doing this a couple of years earlier, with the sort of beginnings of people maybe getting a little bit, more aggressive or oppositional. Maybe now those first 10 years start getting a bit rocky. And spoiler is that they absolutely do. And I feel like it all starts with the Pope in this direct opposition and this counter-reformation. So this question here, perhaps just to think about it a little bit, maybe you want to pause the video and answer it in your book or in your notes. Why would the people not going to church be a problem for Elizabeth? I think we've already talked about that at length, but just try to get a bit of a formal answer in your book. Similarly to Nazi Germany, if they're not going, they're not hearing the messages, and therefore the power of the message is being diluted, isn't it? Everyone who doesn't go is one less person who doesn't know, which dilutes their influence, I suppose. Okay, so that's the sort of first bit. Hopefully we made that clear here a little bit, how this Catholic interference is one thing, but when it comes from the Pope, all right, that's very much different, isn't it? Okay, so give this a bit of a threat level, as we've done previously. 1, no threat at all. 5, extremely. Pause this video and just explain why you've given it the score that you have. I feel this is more dangerous than anything the Puritans did. But that's up to you, and it'd be interesting to see what you think on this one. When you're ready, unpause and we'll carry on. All right, so here's an interpretation to practice with from historian Barbara Mervyn. She says, by 1568, Elizabeth's policies seem to be working. The early problems caused by the settlements seem to be fading. The majority of Catholics outwardly, publicly, conformed, followed the rules without any real leadership from the Pope. They were politically loyal to Elizabeth. So, as always with these things, what is the view? Pause the video and write the answer to this. How do you know? Because it says. And do you agree with Barbara Mervyn with this interpretation of Elizabeth's first 10 years in power? Everything we've talked about today might suggest it's starting to get ropey. But remember to step back a little bit sometimes and look at the big picture. I don't know. I feel like I agree with what Barbara Mervyn's saying here generally, but that can be up to you. So when you're ready, pause and then come back and we will continue. All right, so the Catholic Challenge 2, the Catholic nobility. So this is at home in England. So obviously the first thought with the nobles is they have private armies. That should be your initial thought, your first worry, if you like. Remember to be filling in the sheet in the headings that we've got earlier on in the video, or just make some notes generally. The Catholic nobles are definitely a threat. The most powerful noble, as we know, is the Duke of Norfolk, who is a Catholic. these guys could get together and bring an army to London, and Elizabeth probably wouldn't stand much of a chance if they decided to do that. So let's see the details of the nobility, the challenge to the settlement. Most of England's nobles are Catholic. Of course they are. She's new in power. They have probably been given their titles from Mary. But don't forget, other than a few short years of Edward in there, the country has generally been Catholic forever. So the ancient noble families who passed on their titles, of course they're going to be Catholic. It's a new religion, this Protestantism. And especially up north, remember, they are more Catholic up there. So she relies on the nobles keeping law and order. Remember that whole government thing? She doesn't want to upset them too much, but she also can't allow them to be too powerful. So in the feudal system, she gives land and titles to the nobles in the hope that they do something for her if needed. And it will generally be to keep law and order in the locations, the local areas of the country, because she's based in London. So it's a fine balance of keeping these nobles on side. Remember that patronage as well we talked about? That was another way that she might be able to do that. So, as far as the religious settlement is concerned, it's estimated that about 1/3 of the nobles were recusants, especially in the northwest. All right, so up Liverpool, Manchester ways. That's 1/3. That's a lot of people who are not setting the example, not as the bosses, as the leaders of the towns and villages and counties, not lead them by example, and also possibly inspiring just the normal folks in the streets to not go to church because they're thinking, well, if the recusants aren't going, if the nobles aren't going, why should we? Bear in mind, 12 pence is a lot of money for a worker, nearly a week's wages. To a noble, it's a drop in the ocean. So the people have to consider that too if they do decide to stop going to church. So the two particular nobles that we're going to be talking about quite a lot, we'll talk about them briefly in this context in challenging the settlement, but we'll do the Northern Rebellion in a lot more detail in a couple of lessons where we'll spend a whole lot longer with the two dukes of the Earl of Northumberland and Westmoreland, these powerful northern nobles. They have been really powerful under Mary, really influential in the Privy Council, in the court. When Elizabeth comes along, they believe that she's sort of eroding their powers. She's not listening to them too much, and you'll see in a couple of lessons' time that they're probably not wrong, actually. Elizabeth starts to interfere in the politics of the north. For years and years and years, whoever's been the king or queen, they've generally left these northern nobles to get on with it and do their own thing up there. Elizabeth, no. Elizabeth is going to be a little bit more influential, shall we say. So they also hate the fact that Elizabeth's favourites at court are low-born. They hate Robert Dudley and they hate William Cecil. These two guys have clearly got the Queen's ear, clearly got massive influence, but they're not nobility. They're not from the old noble families. They've rose to power some way, luck, judgment, special friends, I don't know. So these northern nobles, in fact lots of the nobles, they particularly hate Robert Dudley and William Cecil. So I don't know if particularly the Northern Rebellion that we're going to briefly talk about in a sec is to do with the settlement or just the general anger and hatred towards some of the things Elizabeth's done. I feel like the settlement has probably been the spark for it, really. So this little summary picture here doesn't take much to work out what it's saying. Westmoreland is basically saying Elizabeth doesn't listen to the Catholics like Mary did. No one listens to us at court, feeling a bit sorry for themselves. The Protestant Queen prefers these new low-born people. And the Earl of Northumberland is saying the people in the north of England would support us. They're mainly Catholic and they want to return to Catholicism. Remember that the Pope has issued this papal bull as well. So Northumberland is essentially saying, let's do something about this. Let's rise up against this Queen and put it all back to how it used to be. The Pope will be happy with us. The Counter-Reformation will be going on, etc. That's the sort of plan of the Northern Rebellion, and it will involve the Duke of Norfolk as well. So we'll talk about that, as I say, in a bit more detail in a few lessons' time. But for now, for the sake of this being a potential challenge to the religious settlement, let's just have a little breakdown of what's happened. So if you just, as we see the events of the Northern Rebellion, just pop them down in your book, summarise what happened. So this is 1569, 10 years after the settlement, but really crucially, can you make this note somewhere, please? This is 1 year after Mary Queen of Scots arrives in England. I don't know if you would say that's a coincidence. It's a very big coincidence, isn't it? That as soon as she arrives, the northern nobles feel that now is the time to attack Elizabeth. They haven't bothered for 10 years. I don't know, perhaps the papal bull and the counter-reformation, the excommunication from the Pope, has inspired them too. But all of a sudden, Elizabeth now needs to be a bit more on edge. I think that's fair to say. So let's go through the events of the Northern Rebellion very briefly. We will look at this as its own separate plot in a few lessons' time. But just the gist of it goes along with Westmoreland and Northumberland. They lead a rebellion in the north of England, and they're going to march down south to hopefully change things. They take Durham Cathedral, which is obviously publicly embarrassing for Elizabeth. It's one of the biggest cathedrals in the country, one of the most important, and they have a full public Catholic Mass. So that transubstantiation, this is essentially them putting two fingers up to Elizabeth and the religious settlement. To do it in that place, in such a prolific cathedral, and to do it so publicly, would have infuriated the Queen. But these two nobles, I feel like they're quite confident. They think they might get away with this. Obviously, as it goes, because this is so early in the course, you could probably infer that they don't. And they don't. But for now, let's just see what's going to happen. So one of the aims of the Northern Rebellion is to marry Mary, Queen of Scots, to the Duke of Norfolk. Both of those have family links. They're cousins of each other, the three of them, Elizabeth, Mary, and Norfolk. So that's just a bit weird. But if Norfolk and Mary have a child, then its legitimacy is absolutely nailed on. There's no concern or issue that it's not a legitimate Tudor. Obviously, Mary's got a little boy, James, who is the heir, potentially the heir to the throne anyway. But if this marriage went ahead, they would then remove Elizabeth with this new, lovely, powerful royal couple. Obviously, folks, you know that that's treason, right? So we'll see how that unfolds. But like I said before, I don't know if it's a coincidence that this rebellion's happened the year after Mary Queen of Scots arrives, and the fact that Mary Queen of Scots is going to be part of it, whether she knew or not is another matter, but it's in her name potentially. So I don't know, maybe it can't be a coincidence. So many other Northern Catholics, of course, they join this rebellion. The Pope has asked them to, and they march south. The rebellion takes a bit of a twist here, where the Duke of Norfolk suddenly panics, tries to cancel the whole thing, but obviously communication is not as quick as it could be, and it all goes a little bit wrong, and then in the end it crumbles. She deals with the rebels very, very brutally. She hangs about 700 of them from London right up to the north, so there's bodies, corpses hanging, as a warning to anyone else who ever attempts to have a rebellion against this queen. This is her first direct challenge. This is definitely more dangerous than the Puritan attacks, because this is with noble soldiers. This is an absolute attack, and Elizabeth was it in risk here. So the fact that she's dealt with it so severely, she has to. The question there, why did she do this, is quite obvious, isn't it? She has to respond to this thing so brutally to make sure it doesn't happen again. Just like her father did, just like every monarch ever does. They have to try and make sure that people are scared to not rebel. So these two nobles obviously have made a bit of a mistake here, and the fact that they bottled it, or the Norfolk bottled it, it's not going to end well for them. So just make sure you've got these events noted down. Like I say, we'll come back to the Northern Rebellion as a whole lesson. It's really quite interesting what happens during, because of it, and then of course after it. But for now, let's look at it through the lens of this is some sort of opposition to the religious settlement, and how dangerous is it. So again, thinking about in your notes, 1 to 5, how dangerous is this? And if we're considering this in the sense of comparing to the Puritans, in a 16 marker, which we'll have a look at potential questions in a sec, I feel like it's foolish to argue, or dangerous to argue, that the Puritan challenge is more dangerous than the Catholic challenge, particularly the nobles at home with their armies and with the power of the Pope as well. So, as with the Puritans, let's just make sure we end this video with a little bit of exam focus to make sure we try and get these things into our answers in our paragraphs. Just remember there are large numbers of Catholic nobles, 90% of the country, although it's slowly but surely going down. At this stage, 10 years in, it's still very, very high. Many Marian bishops, so bishops from Mary's reign, are still in the House of Lords. They continue to threaten the settlement. Obviously, they didn't manage to stop it being passed, but they will continue to chip away at it. The fear of the Catholic noble uprising was always on Elizabeth's mind, and then it happened in 1569. They have the resources to destroy Elizabeth very quickly, which would of course get rid of the settlement. They also have some motive. Once the settlement is passed, they could really bring out any rebellion whenever they wanted. It just so happens that the settlement was relatively fair. All right, so maybe that's what held it off for 10 years. The papal bull, the year after, officially in 1570, told Catholics not to go to her church, following the earlier message in 1566 to stop going. This papal bull is official, and of course it follows the year after the Northern Rebellion and 2 years after Mary Queen of Scots arrives in England. So again, this is where you're building up that sort of backstory and contextual knowledge in your paragraph about why it's dangerous, or more dangerous, say, than the Puritans. The settlement being so moderate meant it was continually challenged, be it by recusants or the Puritans, just going off about it a little bit. The fact that it was so moderate means that some people, someone's not going to like it. But luckily, Elizabeth's relying on the fact that the vast majority of the country were quite happy with it. So if this was a 12 marker, this is what it would look like. Explain why Elizabeth faced threats to her religious settlement from the Catholics. It would even be better, I would think, a nice fair question, if it was explain why Elizabeth faced threats to her religious settlements, full stop. So one paragraph Puritans, one paragraph Catholics at home, so the nobles and the recusants, and one paragraph the threat from Europe with the Pope and the papal bull. That would be a lovely 12 marker. If it was a 16 marker, remember, as always, a 16 marker, same as medicine, it's going to have a statement that you're going to have to agree with and argue with. In this case, this example, it says the Northern Rebellion was the biggest challenge from the Catholics to the religious settlements. Do you agree? So that would be the nobles, quite a big threat. They've got an army, blah, blah, blah. The Pope's influence, maybe that's more important, the fact that perhaps foreign countries might get involved in this. It might also be a nicer 16 marker to say that the Catholic challenge was the biggest challenge to the settlement than the Puritans. Do you agree? So essentially, remember, these answers stay the same. The 3 paragraphs in the middle generally stay the same. With your 16 marker, we got to keep comparing and arguing against whatever the focus of the question is. So if you want to have a go at those questions, either in your booklets or just generally, and hand them in as part of your 16 marks a fortnight, then that might be quite useful to do after we've done this lesson. I feel like being confident on the challenges to the settlements, would we be able to answer any question, be it 2 marker, 12 marker, or 16 marker. Okay, thank you very much as ever for listening to this. Any questions, as always, let us know, and remember, everything that you need is on our website. And don't forget as well, in the Google Classroom, we've got our one-stop shop, every revision resource you need, videos and things as well. So let us know what you think, how dangerous these threats were, keeping in mind always comparing to the Puritans and the Catholics. And we will see you again soon. Thank you very much, and goodbye.